What is up, guys? This is Weasel for PokerWeasel.com. This is the introduction to the core maths series. This is going to be module 2.0 on my undergraduate course. In this video, we're just going to talk very briefly about the concepts which will be discussed in this video series. Essentially, the core maths course is a collection of all the basic maths you need in order to be a winning poker player. These are the things we're going to discuss. The golden formula. You'll find out what exactly we mean by the golden formula in part 1 of this series. Basically, it's a multi-functioning formula that you can use in a variety of different situations. We're going to have a look at how we can use the golden formula in two very important and common poker situations. We're going to have a look at odds and outs. Many of you will already know how to do this, but it's definitely a very good idea to revisit this topic. We're also going to talk about how you can perform pot odds calculations very quickly. That's one of the things that players struggle with, is they understand how pot odds works, but they can't actually use it in a real game scenario. Either they just can't do the mental arithmetic fast enough, or perhaps they're using a method which doesn't really help them to perform the calculation quickly. So if either of these are problematic areas, they're going to be discussed in part 2 of this series on odds and outs. We're going to talk about implied odds. If players struggle with calculating pot odds on the spot, then even more so the case with implied odds. It's almost like a pot odds calculation plus an additional calculation afterwards. We're going to talk about what implied odds is, how we can use it in a real game situation. We'll also talk about, once more, shortcuts for being able to make implied odd estimates as efficiently and as quickly as possible in a real game scenario. Part 4, we're going to talk about reverse implied odds, how the calculation works for reverse implieds. Many players understand how to do implied odds calculations. It's one of the things that we learn earlier on in our poker career in most cases, but many players have never thought about how does a calculation work for reverse implied odds. What is the relationship between implied odds and reverse implied odds? How can we recognize reverse implied odds in a game situation? And how will knowledge of our reverse implied odds affect our decision in certain scenarios? These are all things that we're going to be discussing in part 4 of this series. Part 5, we'll talk about probability 101. For this part of the series, it's not necessary to have any pre-existing knowledge of maths. We're not going to assume too much throughout this entire series, in fact, so if you have no idea regarding maths, don't worry, you should still be able to benefit from this series. And that's exactly why we have this section on probability 101. Many poker players lack the basic understanding of how this particular aspect of mathematics works, i.e. probability. So we really just want to go over the absolute basics here. This is going to include things like ascertaining the probability of two successive events. For example, let's say we open raise the button and small blind folds 80% of the time and big blind folds 70% of the time. How often do both players fold to our button steal? This is an example of an extremely fundamental question that every poker player should really be able to answer. If you can't answer that question, don't worry, that's why we're having this video on probability 101. Generally speaking, good understanding of probability is a prerequisite for understanding how to perform EV calculations. And that's what we are going to consider in part 6 of this core math series, EV calculations. EV stands for expected value and is basically a measure of the profitability of certain decisions in our hand. And as a rough guide, in order to be able to use EV calculations, we need to have a knowledge of how frequently certain events occur. So it's going to have links back to part 5 of this series where we talk about probability. If we don't do part 5, we might struggle with part 6. In part 7, we're actually going to touch on some slightly more advanced mathematical concepts. Now, we're not going to go through the full breakdown of GTO approximations of poker play. That's going to be something that we look at in the postgraduate part of my course. For now, we're just going to introduce ourselves to what optimal play is and have a look at some basic calculations that surround optimal play. I'm not going to do anything super complicated here, so don't worry too much. If you've understood part 1 through 6 of this series, you should have no problem understanding part 7. If you're interested in learning about range versus range equity and equity distributions, then this series is probably not for you. There will be an advanced mathematical series in my postgraduate course coming out at some time in the future. So this is really just an introduction into the core maths required for playing poker. Think of this as a basic literacy course for using numbers in poker. So just a quick word on maths. Many players don't like to use maths. Many players describe themselves as field players, and they simply hate maths. They like poker, but they don't like maths. So here is why, if you fall into that category, you may still find this series interesting. Firstly, the best players use maths. It's not a big secret. If you don't understand the mathematical principles that govern poker, your progress as a poker player is going to be capped. There's going to be a point in your career where you're making a certain amount of money, but you can't progress beyond that because the players at the higher limits all have a much better and sounder understanding of the mathematical principles that surround poker. So firstly, by learning about these mathematical concepts and thinking about how you can incorporate them into your game is essentially going to uncap your progress as a poker player. In other words, if you understand maths very well, the sky is the limit. But if you don't understand maths, you're going to find that you meet a roadblock at some point in your poker career. The other point here is that you don't have to like maths to use it to make money. So we're not saying that you watch this video series and you walk away thinking, wow, that was great, I love maths so much. Some people like maths. I like maths. I think it's fun. I love looking at how maths governs various poker decisions. Not everyone's like that. Some people hate maths. But at the end of the day, most people don't hate money. So even if you don't like watching a video series on maths, at the end of the day, this is going to translate to additional profits. It's going to increase your bankroll at a faster rate. So you don't have to like maths. No one's telling you have to like it. But if you like money and you would like to make some more money, then having an understanding of how maths governs various poker principles is an integral part of your development. So either consider it as an investment. Okay, you don't like maths, but you're going to improve your win rate. You're going to make more money. That's fine. So maths is actually useful in that sense. Or just think of it as a challenge. Some people consider themselves mathematically challenged. They don't like maths, not because they just don't like maths inherently, but they find maths hard. So there's that natural tendency there to try and avoid doing anything that involves maths. So if you fall into that category, just think of it as a challenge. We're not going to be doing anything super difficult throughout this core maths series. Now is your chance to improve your basic understanding of maths. Think of it as a type of basic literacy course. So the maths you do in this series very likely has the potential to help you in other areas of your life also. I would describe this in some senses not as a poker maths course, but more of a poker arithmetic course. We're going to be looking at calculations that we should be doing in our head. We're not going to be doing any difficult mathematical calculations. We're going to be doing things like pot odds, etc. So most of the maths in this series we should be able to do without a calculator. We should be able to do it in our head. The way I would differentiate poker arithmetic from poker maths is that poker maths really refers to some of the more advanced stuff that you're going to end up doing in poker. Things like looking at range versus range equity, balancing multiple bet sizing ranges, looking at equity distributions, that kind of stuff. I would consider that to be poker maths. So in that regard, we're not actually going to be doing any poker maths in this series. We're going to be doing poker arithmetic, which is basically maths. It's just a very easy version of maths, and it's maths that can be done in our head and will benefit us during a hand. Real poker maths is more the kind of stuff we do off the table when we're analyzing the game. The stuff that we're going to be looking at in this series is maths that's designed to be used on the table during a hand of poker. We're going to be making use of this maths cheat sheet alongside this series. So if you purchase all videos in the series, then you're also entitled to this maths cheat. So if you've purchased all videos in the series and you don't have the maths cheat sheet, then just send me a message and you can get this cheat sheet also. So this is included as we look at the various types of arithmetic that we're going to be doing. We're also going to be seeing how we can use this particular maths sheet to accelerate that. The goal is, of course, understanding how to perform these calculations in our head. But I have heard reports from certain live players that they do actually use this sheet when they're playing live, if they want to calculate their pot odds, etc. That's not really the goal of this series, but that is one of the potential uses of this particular Excel document. It can also just be used for analyzing your game away from the table, but you don't really need to do the maths in your head. You can just use this sheet to accelerate that. So throughout the series, we're going to be making use of the various formulas on this sheet and seeing how we can use this sheet to help us with various questions regarding pot odds, implied odds, etc. Alright, so thanks for taking the time to check out this introductory video. look forward to catching you in the first part of this series where we're going to be talking about the golden formula. Alright, thanks guys. This was Weasel for PokerWeasel.com.